Always nice to take the time just to, even though we're probably all at home or wherever, but to also feel that we're together in this modern way online. And yeah, so that it generates some sense of appreciation. And even in a bigger sense, just this connection with the lineage that for so many generations, human beings with busy lives, all of the challenges that come with human existence, they got interested in these teachings and practices and did their best and developed some wisdom in their lives. And some of them were able to articulate it and pass it along one generation after another. In our tradition, our original teaching, a teacher rather, the Buddha who lived 2,600 years ago, I mean, that's an impressive thing. And then somehow in this weird Zoom environment, we're the continuation of that. Folks, human beings, interested, finding these teachings not just interesting, but really liberating and healing and functional. And in our busy lives, finding time to develop the practices so that the teachings just aren't intellectual, but we're really seeing things about the nature of our mind, the nature of how suffering comes and how it can go. Yeah, it's one of the rare emotions, as the Buddha said, this gratitude, this appreciation. So we take it, we find it where we can, so to appreciate the community, appreciate these teachings, which are really the lineage of human common sense in the deepest sense of the word, common sense. It's really, this is how it works, having a human life. This is how the heart gets bound up. This is how the heart can find release. And it's good to bring that appreciation and that attitude to our sitting time now. So let's just turn our attention to our temple, this sitting body here. We don't need to go to the church or the synagogue or the Buddhist temple, because we create this beautiful temple, however our body is. We find a way as best we can for the body to express some qualities of comfort and safety and physical release. And part of the temple we're creating is this sense of uprightness, this willingness, I should say, of being awake, sitting upright in the middle of our experience, this dance of mental and physical activities coming and going. And in a sense, we're embracing the sensitivity of the heart, the mind, a kind of exposure that just comes with the territory of being a human being. But instead of being irritated by it, or instead of feeling we have to direct the sensitivity, we just let that nature of the mind or the heart sensitivity do what it does. It senses, it feels, it knows. And we're just exploring this powerful balance of sensitivity, trusting sensitivity, sensitive to the way it is moment by moment. It's the balance of that sensitivity with this wisdom, this kind of earthy, developing wisdom that understands that getting tight, getting fixed, getting attached, clinging, it just doesn't help. Getting greedy, getting aversive, it may be understandable, that reaction to sense experience, to a thought, to a memory, to a sound, to a sensation. It may make sense that the mind reacts in a particular way, but it doesn't contribute to one's well-being, doesn't contribute to the release of tension, the release of suffering. It goes the other way. And we learn this lesson over and over and over. So let these be the two pillars of our practice this evening: sensitivity and trusting it, and not being confused, not having to be confused or reactive to what we're sensitive to. Thoughts are just thoughts. Emotional feelings are just emotional feelings being known. Sensations are just sensations being felt. Sounds are just sounds being heard. Sights, whether the eyes are open or closed, are just that seeing being known. Smells and tastes are just that, smells and tastes being known. I take refuge in the trusting of sensitivity. I take refuge in this possibility of non-attachment, letting things be. In the relative safety of our sitting time. Maybe it really is okay to just simply allow the bodily and mental activities to come and go, to do what they're going to do. But seeing clearly, right? Deeply sensitive, awake, open, but not out of habit creating friction or resistance to what comes and goes in the body and mind, internally, externally. We're exploring this possibility that everything is allowed to come and go, is allowed to be what it is. A sound being heard, a thought being thought, an emotion being felt, sensation being felt. Not less, not more. And it's in this way that we're practicing coming into alignment with the way it is in the deepest sense. Not the way we think it is or the way I think I am, but in this more direct, immediate, elemental sense. So let's continue now in silence. Just feeling what we feel as we begin to move the body. And thanks again, everyone, for showing up tonight. Maybe I'll open it up for a few questions about the talk last week for those who were here, but just more specifically about meditation practice before going into the talk for this evening. So if there are any questions, it's one thing to remember about the Q&A times. It's often what we have to say or the questions that we ask leads to conversation that can be useful for a lot of people. And there's a way of kind of illuminating the nature of our minds in these kind of give and take conversations. So that's just an encouragement. If you do have a question or even an experience that you want to just share with the group that maybe I can help unpack or add my own reflections on, feel free to speak. You could just unmute yourself, introduce yourself. It's always nice when people say their first name, maybe where you're calling from. You can also share your pronouns if you like. Yeah, anything feel worth bringing forward at this time?
Hey,
Go
Mark.
ahead, Nick.
Hey, everybody. I'm Nick. I use they, them pronouns. I'm in St. Paul, Minnesota. And something I experienced earlier in the day doing some meditation was just how there would be one source of suffering that I would kind of be working with and accepting, and that would come to pass. And then there would be the next thing would pop up as a source of, kind of suffering, or the next thing to kind of deal with. And then I would find a skillful way to deal with that, and then that would go away, and then the next thing would come in, and it was just kind of this first like deeper realization of like, oh, like there really is just going to be like an endless list maybe of different things that I'm going to that you can get tense about, that you can suffer about. And so kind of little scary thought, but also tried to not dig too deep into that. But I don't know, Mark, if you have thoughts on kind of what that experience was like, or what was going on there. But it was kind of, it felt good to realize that. It felt like a positive thing to see.
Yeah, yeah, and a little scary, like you said, Nick. Yeah, no, I think that is a real insight, a real deepening. And, it's really up to the wisdom in our heart to turn those experiences into something that is onward leading instead of like it could lead to pride or it could lead to, oh my God, there's so much work to do. Why bother? Right. So if there's any number of ways to misuse that insight, and there are a few good ways to use that insight too. So it's onward leading. Um, and one thing to understand about, and I'll talk, actually, it's going to come up in the talk tonight because I'm going to talk about the Eightfold Path and especially wisdom and the way the Buddha talked about it. He talked about it both mundane or ordinary level wisdom, which is still something, and then an extraordinary or super mundane level of wisdom. And in an ordinary, what you're talking about is this kind of ordinary level of insight, which is profound. So I use ordinary in the sense that even from our egoic point of view, this learning is quite impactful. So from an egoic point of view, Mark or Nick or all of us in different moments, we see what we haven't seen before about the nature of our conditioned mind, like to be greedy or to be irritated or to be reactive or to be tight in so many different ways. We see like, oh, those patterns have momentum. And we even get from this egoic point of view a sense of it's not that personal, because if it were, I'd stop it, but I can't stop it. It's just like you said, it's almost like a waterfall or ongoing spewing of this kind of thought and this sort of reaction and this comparing mind and this planning mind and this fantasy and this worry and this hopefulness and, and this attraction to some pleasant sense experience and this fear of this happening. And it's appropriate for the heart to wonder, like, where is the end of this? It's actually quite skillful. It's both skillful to have just enough of the fear, because what it does is that fear, if related to skillfully, gets converted into sincerity and humility, and like, I really want to get to the bottom of this. I want to understand what can be understood by my mind, by a human mind. I don't just want to keep spinning in my tracks, or that image the Buddha uses that's so potent of it's called, like, the simile is called something like the 40 cartloads. And the Buddha gave this example to some of his students. He said, so imagine there's a bonfire, and every once in a while, the person throws in 40 cartloads of dried branches and, other flammable material into the bonfire. What do you suppose will happen? And of course, all the students, being wise, said, well, that bonfire is going to burn for a long, long time. And then the Buddha says, well, suppose that person doesn't periodically throw in 40 cartloads of fuel. What's going to happen to that bonfire? And those wise student of his said the obvious thing, which, well, that bonfire is going to burn out because no one's putting any fuel in it. So this is that poignant moment that Nick is describing, where we really see the bonfire. We see the momentum of our conditioned mind, our habit-based mind, don't we, in moments? And it scares us. And it should scare us, because it's like, oh, what we're really sensing is all the past ways the mind has been relating has set some momentum in motion. And then now we're experiencing that in the present moment with awareness. Oh, this is the nature of the conditioned or habit-based mind. Oh, not necessarily a pretty sight. I mean, there are some wholesome qualities arising, hopefully from time to time, but a lot of it is just sort of miscellaneous neurotic stuff. And some of it is quite toxic and self-harmful stuff, that arises in our minds. And it's a sign of deepening of practice when we have a more honest relationship to what is arising in our mind. And we learn to handle the fear, or the appropriate, like, let's call it, just to kind of make it different, because usually we use fear as a negative or an unwholesome quality of mind. Let's call it wholesome concern. Oh, this is what's been set in motion. Past is over. I can't really do anything about the way the mind is conditioned, but I can stop adding fuel, stop fueling these patterns that are being experienced as oppressive. And that's the resolve now, Rick or Nick, you can leave with from that insight. Is like, find a way, just a very personal way, to resolve, like, I really want to understand how this has been fed so I don't feed it anymore. Because things don't just happen. Those patterns, that spewing of the mind, mental activity, mental proliferation, that has causes, past causes. So I don't want to do what I did in the past to feed those particular patterns. Yeah, thanks, Nick. Other questions? Yeah, Deborah, did you have a thought? Go ahead and unmute yourself.
Yeah, so you hear different teachings. Like, some teachings are when you feel or you have an unpleasant thought or feeling or whatever, to go with it, and to feel it or to experience it, and then not too long, but experience it, but then sort of another teaching is, well, we'll try to avoid those thoughts or feelings. And it's harder with feelings, I think. Thoughts are easier to let go of than feelings. So Yeah, sometimes sometimes those teachings seem kind of contradictory.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's a really good question, Deborah. And it's because our mind is in different places at different times. Sometimes our mind, right? And I don't think it's just me, but sometimes my mind is really needy and really susceptible to being seduced, like in the sense of getting identified with my stuff, like when it gets triggered or gets aroused, right? So then the practice, when our mind is in a more primitive or a less skillful place, then our Dharma practice is going to arise with a more parental energy, right? Honey, don't do that. Come over here. So what you call, Deborah, avoiding, like, right? And we need sometimes that's exactly the medicine the mind or the heart needs. We need this more directive parent that's going to guide us and says, listen, been there, done that. I know better. Don't go there,
Mhm.
you know? And you turn the mind's attention here. Pay attention to hearing. Pay attention to the breath. Notice how the body feels sitting, and then the mind, because of the magnetic pull, the momentum of that habit, it goes back. And then the parent doesn't give up. No. Whatever you do, I'm not going to let you play in the street, dear one. And you pick the child back up and you say, here. But you don't hate the child because the child is just acting out it doesn't know better. It just thinks the street is a fine place to play. But you know that cars zip by and you don't want the child playing in the street. So you keep persisting, you pick it up, you put it here. And then when there's more stability, then the parent like gives the child a little space. Well, maybe the child will realize the danger in doing that, and I don't have to intervene, but I'm going to keep a close eye on the child and see if it knows on its own not to take a hold, not to do the thing that's unskillful, just how to stay out of danger, right?
Mhm.
And sometimes there's a lot of confidence that the wisdom that knows the difference between what's helpful and unhelpful, what's skillful and unskillful, is really integrated. So then there's no need for a parental energy. Actually, it would be unskillful in those moments for you as a practitioner to take on that parental role and tell your attention what to do. Because there's enough wisdom and enough stability that whatever arises, like even a really toxic old habit of mind, if somehow the events in the moment trigger my defensiveness or my reactivity, my neediness, or whatever it might be, there's enough space, that wise and kind space. Oh, yeah, that's how it is sometimes.
Mm.
This really old pattern of being needy or being afraid arises. It feels like this. And it's almost like wisdom, without having to say it, is expressing, I'm not afraid of this pattern because I know it comes and it goes. And
Mhm.
I know how not to feed it. So I'm not afraid of it arising because without being fed, it's going to cease on its own. I don't have to do anything to make it go away.
Mm.
Those unhelpful patterns stick around because we're feeding them, but we don't realize we're feeding them because it's unconscious. We just get identified and we proliferate and we either run with it or we are afraid of the pattern, but both actually feed the pattern, both just getting intoxicated by it and being afraid of it. Oh no, I don't want to be that defensive person, right? But real wisdom, when it's stable, then we just trust, you know, oh yeah, the wisdom will see, well, that's just the natural arising. And now this is the natural ceasing of that pattern because it saw it with equanimity. Yeah. Thanks for the
Yeah,
good comment, Deborah.
thanks.
What else comes to mind from the group? Anything? Special learnings that have come up in the last few weeks in your practice, whether formal sitting times or just practicing throughout the day or strong challenges? Yeah, June.
Yeah, I had had a learning of the past couple of days. I spend a lot of time alone. I live alone, and I have I have times when I can really get myself into kind of a rut of negative thinking and depressive thinking. And I noticed over the past couple of days, I've had some periods of um, awareness, just being here, just going about the activities of daily living, just being a little bit more aware for a longer period of time. And during that time, I've noticed, oh my goodness, uh, this mind will come up with a thought, a frightening thought, or a thought about loss, and it will feed it. And I guess I could see the mind just going on this feeding frenzy of just feeding this thought and building it. And it just, it was like, oh my goodness, I don't have to do that. The value of awareness in everyday life is seeing that happening, and it's not like I have to stop it, just seeing it. It's like just seeing that was like enough to say, oh my goodness, of course I don't want to do that. It's just a matter of being aware enough for a long enough period of time, and that just was it was such a lift for my practice, seeing that and feeling like, wow, that really lends a sense of urgency yeah, this feeling of wanting to spend more time in the present moment. It is a really good thing, and yeah, it can really change one's life. It's just a really hopeful thing for me in my practice right now.
Yeah, that's a powerful transmission, June. Just you sharing that, right? Just the energy of you sharing that's really, yeah, it's potent. And that's for those of you nerds, Buddhist nerds who like maps. What June is talking about is really the second noble truth. There is a cause, it should be abandoned, it has been abandoned. But June didn't say she abandoned it. She said, I'm just paraphrasing what June said. She said she saw it and then letting go happened, right? It's like seeing the unnecessariness of that drama and being patient. Like, and if we don't allow, like this is more that trust end of the practice, where we allow, we're relaxed and kind of in the flow. And so some drama arises in the mind where the mind is, like June says, just sort of stirring the pot. Like, and sometimes it's sort of like the mind is just throwing out whatever it can throw out and see what sticks. Like, what will the mind take a hold of? What will the mind cling to? What will get a reaction? Just like we do with our friends and our partners sometimes. It's like, when we're hurting or bored, I mean, I do this. You can ask Wynn. We just sometimes provoke or poke just to see where we can get a reaction. Well, the mind is doing that internally too. And then when wisdom sees that, like June described, it's a real awakening, like, oh, this is how suffering arises. And then not taking the bait is how suffering ceases, right? Seeing it and seeing the unnecessariness of it is what allows things to fall apart. That whole drama, that whole contraction. Yeah, any other thoughts about it, June?
Yeah, I hadn't thought about it in terms of the second noble truth, Mark, but as your words have just illuminated it even further for me. So thank you. It's such a natural thing that happened that I had no part in. It just was it it helped me to understand that wisdom takes over, and the letting go happens. I've never seen the letting go just happen before, and um I had faith that it does, but that to see it was, yeah, really, yeah, really potent. Yeah.
And we keep seeing those, relatively speaking, little moments of letting go. But when there are enough of that clear, natural recognition of the mind in the moment of its letting go, then that insight begins to generalize. So what begins to arise in the mind more and more often is something like, well, how about now? How about not clinging, non-attachment, not being fixed now? It's just sort of a natural part of the mental continuum, the mind unfolding, is this curiosity about how about not clinging now, right? And then moments of clinging just stand out, like, and the mind starts to get interested. Well, that's interesting. The mind's really tight, the heart's really tight. And how about not clinging now? Like even now, this moment, you know? Yeah, thank you, June. Other thoughts from the group? Well, maybe I'll go ahead if there are no more thoughts or questions. But please, if you do, this is a good time. People like to hear from people often. And I'll save a little time at the end for discussion as well. So for some of you, maybe weren't here last week, and just to remind you all that I do record on Tuesday nights and Sunday mornings, and they're related talks Sunday morning and Tuesday nights, and they all land on our YouTube channel, freely available, the video, and the audio is freely available on a wonderful website called dharmaseed.org. All of the teachers at Spirit Rock in California and Insight Meditation Society in Massachusetts have their talks up there, including mine and Shelley's, and are just available for everyone. And you can access that through Common Ground's website, or just go to dharmaseed.org for the audio, or YouTube, and then just search for Common Ground Meditation Center. And last week, I've been talking about the Four Noble Truths as a kind of a central map, but it's really more simple than, the Four Noble Truths. It's really the mind seeing suffering and the releasing of suffering, and just realizing that that's what the heart is actually interested in. It's not that we want a nice meal or a nice interaction with our friend or a good night's sleep. What really is motivating the mind behind everything is like, how come some moments feel so heavy, so difficult, so oppressive? And how come some moments there's less of that oppressiveness, less of that heaviness? And is there anything one can do about it? Like, is it happening to me? Life is happening to me and I just got to put up with it? Or am I participating in it? And this goes to what June was just saying. Like, it's a powerful realization to see how the mind is part of what's making a particular moment oppressive, hard to bear. And how the mind in other moments, how the mind is relating, is responsible for the absence of that weight, that oppressive weight, that heaviness, the fear of anxiousness, of greediness, neediness. This is how Sylvia Boorstein talks about the Four Noble Truths. It's kind of a more earthy way. I might have mentioned this briefly, but I have a little more full version of her comments on this in one of her books she wrote. Life is challenging for everyone. Our physical bodies, our relationships, all of our life circumstances are fragile and subject to change. We are always accommodating, right? Because as soon as we get some solid ground where things are kind of nice and we feel relatively safe, we're always patching it up, because whatever it is that we've gotten, that safe spot we've gotten to, it's not permanent. It requires accommodation and patching up and protection, and and even then, nothing is stable. The second noble truth, she writes, the cause of suffering is the mind's struggle in response to challenge, right? In response to change, in response to the uncertainty and vulnerability. So it isn't the vulnerability, it isn't the uncertainty, and it isn't the change or the challenges that arise. It's the mind's response to challenge, to difficulty. to hope. So it's just interesting to see, like, you know, something difficult can come our way, and hopefully we've had this experience because we really want to illuminate it. And maybe as I'm talking, you'll think of something, but sometimes, especially when it's not too intense, when something bad happens, you'll catch your mind like at a fork in the road. It's like, I could really complain about this. I could get upset, but that would just be, as we say in Buddhism, hitting ourselves with the second dart or the second arrow. This is already an unpleasant moment in my life. Why get tight about it? Right? I already have to figure out what to do, but getting tight about it isn't figuring out how to respond to the difficulty. And that's what we mean by that second arrow. Like, we can't avoid pain. We can't avoid loss. We can't avoid being vulnerable to so many different kinds of insults. It just sort of comes with the territory of having a mind and body, having an existence. But we don't have to get tight about the ordinary ground or activity of being a human being and the vulnerability to change, or what we talk about sometimes are the 8 vicissitudes or the 8 worldly winds of gain, loss, pain, pleasure, fame, disrepute, praise, blame. This is like the short version of how the Buddha says this is just how it is for humans, right? The 10,000 joys and sorrows. So just like think about a time now where, like going back to June's comment, where there was some difficulty and the mind didn't react. Like June could have judged herself when she saw how her mind was entangled in something, right? That it was partly responsible for the tension or whatever, the drama. And that would just have been another layer of drama, wouldn't have it been? But just to sort of like, oh yeah, that's just nature. That's the nature of this conditioned mind. And I'm not gonna feed it by thinking it's bad. I'm not gonna see it in terms of good and bad. Instead, I'm gonna see it as a natural arising due to the many causes and conditions that make up this mind or make up this moment. And that leads to the third noble truth. And Sylvia Burstein writes, the end of suffering is a non-struggling, peaceful mind. Oh, is a non-struggling. A peaceful mind is a possibility. Right? So it doesn't mean not doing. Not struggling is not the same as not responding. It just means the response doesn't need to include that tight struggle arising out of fear or aversion or greed. We can just respond. It's a little bit like nature response, when water, and the Buddha uses this simile a lot in the suttas and the discourses, when water rains down from the clouds and then flows down the side of a mountain, it doesn't get upset when that flow of the water runs into a hill or a rock, It just does what water does. It flows around it or soaks into the ground and becomes part of an underground current of water, or, but one way or another, water does what it does. It kind of goes to the lowest place, and eventually some of it at least gets back in the ocean, and right. But we don't personalize, we don't personify that whole water cycle. You could imagine almost like a satire, somebody turning the water cycle. I remember as an elementary school teacher, for second and third graders, one of the natural science projects was to do a unit on the water cycle, and talk about evaporation and rain and, all that kind of stuff. And you can do kind of stuff to demonstrate to kids how that actually works. But you can imagine someone like personifying it, like, the heat beating down on you, and finally you can't take it anymore and you become vapor, just to get out of that hot ocean or whatever, and then this happens. But it isn't that way at all. It's just a natural process. There's no friction. Friction would only be when we personify it, like, oh, the water droplets don't want to turn to vapor, or the water droplets can't wait to turn to vapor, right? We turn it into a personal drama. And that's what we do. We're just nature too. But we have this very pervasive habit of telling a personal story about what is actually just a natural process. And we are so used to telling that personal story that it's become so compelling that we're afraid of not telling of that story. Different versions of the same story. Oh, poor me, or what about me, or oh, I want that, or I don't want that, or what happens if I become this, or I don't want to become that. So life is challenging for everyone. Our physical bodies, our relationships, all of our life circumstances are fragile and subject to change. We are always accommodating. The cause of suffering is the mind's struggle in response to challenge. The end of suffering, a non-struggling, peaceful mind, is a possibility. Is that right? Right? An end of suffering. I mean, that's a pretty provocative promise, I guess you could say, from the Buddha. An end of suffering, a non-struggling, peaceful mind is a possibility, no matter the condition. Not when you get things all together in your life, but it's a possibility in any moment. Are we interested in that possibility now? And then the last is the program, the Eightfold Path, for ending suffering is wise understanding, wise intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, and wise concentration. And that's really what I want to talk about tonight, just maybe go into a little more depth about the Eightfold Path. And it's always up to us, whether we like it or not, to turn these teachings, these maps that the Buddha articulated and people have been repeating down through the generations, to use these maps to make them our own so that they're actually useful. And useful means we see what we're not yet seeing clearly in our own experience, right? That's the only purpose of the maps. Not to, I think I forget who was telling this story, maybe it was Ajahn Sumedho, about like, he tells it this way, he says, God hands you a key. You feel so grateful that God gave you this key to remove, that unlocks suffering, that you build this beautiful little temple and you put the key in the temple, and every morning you walk around the temple and do your bows and throw flower petals and whatever else you like to do, because you're so grateful that you have this key, but you never use it. Then after a while of all that sort of gratitude and devotional energy, and your life hasn't really changed, you start to feel like, well, what a setup that was. Here I thought God was, giving me this special thing, and that was going to be my salvation, and yet I just find my mind is still the same old, and I've got my worries, and I've got my fears, and I got my anxiety, and I've got my neediness, and I've got my this and my that, and then you kind of swing the other way from devotion to sort of like cynicism. Like, what the F? I'm not gonna, be a spiritual person anymore, I'm just gonna drink cocoa and watch TV or something. And the point is, to figure out how to use the key. And it's the same. Now, we're not getting these teachings from God. We're getting them from a human being who understood something deep about their own mind and had the capacity to articulate it so that we can then at least receive it as teachings on this sort of cognitive level. But the real work is, what am I going to do with these teachings? And the Buddha was really clear, like he did the Eightfold Path, this path of awakening, It isn't his. There's this great little story told back in the day, when the Buddha was alive. He said, it's just as if a person traveling along a wilderness track were to see an ancient path, an ancient road traveled by people of former times. They would follow it. Following it, they would see an ancient city, an ancient capital, inhabited by people of former times, complete with parks, groves, ponds, walled and delightful. In the same way, I saw an ancient path, an ancient road traveled by awakened ones of former times. And what is that ancient path? Just this Eightfold Path: wise view, wise thought or intention, wise speech, wise action, wise livelihood, wise effort, wise mindfulness, wise concentration. Following it, I came to direct knowledge of fabrications, direct knowledge of how these fabrications arise, direct knowledge of how they cease, direct knowledge of the path leading to the cessation of fabrication. And he goes on about all aspects of the mind, not just how our mind fabricates stuff, and seeing how that arises and how that ceases, how perception arises and ceases, consciousness arises and ceases, craving arises and ceases, feeling, tone arises and ceases. He goes on for all of the different aspects of the chain of dependent origination. But it's basically just seeing that all aspect of the mind and body comes and goes, arises and ceases. This is the path. And so, when the Buddha talks about the Eightfold Path, it's really a process of purifying the mind. And the different aspects of the Eightfold Path are really, in some ways, just different frequencies of our life, gross at one end and most subtle at the other end. And we're bringing this wisdom awareness because that's the purifying force. Ignorance is what's allowing things to keep doing what they've done before, right? Samsara, the continuity of cycles that end up being oppressive and causing anxiety and uneasiness in our heart. And what purifies that is illuminating those patterns with that stable wisdom and awareness, present moment awareness. We see it. So a part of that process of purification, let's just talk about sila first. So there are 3 parts of the Eightfold Path: wise action, wise speech, wise livelihood. And so this is our relational world, relating to others, relating to community. And so that's really what we mean by wise action, wise speech, wise livelihood. Like, how are we getting along? How are we harmonizing or not harmonizing? And we start getting really honest about the pain of not harmonizing in this grosser part of our life, this sort of outer part of our life where we're in relationship with each other. Even as a hermit, we're in a relationship with the outer world, with nature, where we get our food, where we get our water, where we poop, where we sleep. It's like we're always in relationship on this sort of animal, basic human mammal level. And how's that going? How's that working for us? And we bring the stability of present moment awareness to our actions, to the words we speak, even the thoughts we think, and the way we kind of stay alive, earn our livelihood, right? We bring wisdom and awareness we illuminate it, not to judge it, and not even to directly fix it, but just to illuminate it. And we go from the torment of guilt and remorse and, you know, the pain of people not liking us and hating us, and just all the pain that we experience in our relational world, in our relationships, to the bliss of blamelessness, where we learn how to give ourselves and each other the gift of safety. Like when I relate to my partner, when I relate to my friends, I'm relating in a way that isn't threatening myself or them. And it doesn't mean we become a softie and don't know how to take care of us. It just means that even when we have to be fierce or strong, we're not hating. We're just taking care of what needs to be taken care of. But we're not throwing anybody out of our heart. And we care about their well-being, even as we take care of our own well-being. And it isn't to anybody's well-being to take advantage of me, So if someone's taking advantage of us, it's not like we say, well, I don't want to interrupt your well-being by sort of sticking up for myself, because it's not good for them. We need to harmonize. Like, how can we both work together? And a lot of times we think, no, this is a dog-eat-dog world on this relational level, and that's just the way it is. But I'm not sure we've actually explored whether it's possible to live in a harmonious way, where we're caring for our own well-being and the well-being of others. So that's the first part of the Eightfold Path, wise action. And generally that means following the precepts, undertaking the training not to kill, not to take what hasn't been given, not to engage in sexual misconduct or sexuality that causes harm, not to speak in ways that is not true, and not to intoxicate the mind. That just makes it more likely that we'll act out in ways that are harmful. Wise speech is just that fourth precept broken down in detail, like not gossiping and not engaging in idle speech that isn't helping anybody, and not using speech as a weapon to cause harm, and not speaking falsehoods. And then wise livelihood just means like finding a way to survive that doesn't require other people's suffering, like the making of poisons or the making of weapons or the making of intoxicants. These are sort of the traditional don'ts in terms of wise livelihood, or earning a living by having to exploit people or enslave them in ways that they have no freedom or no ability to have a happy existence, taking advantage of the power that we have to exploit people. So and again, instead of thinking of that in an idealistic way, like how am I going to do this right? It's like, no, how can I bring awareness to this part of my life? And that will be what purifies my actions, my speech, and my livelihood. So let's say you have a job that you think is questionable. Like, is this really wise livelihood or not? You're not going to figure that out cognitively. You're just going to start being more sensitive and not judgmental. Just really sensitive, awake in both the breadth of awareness and the subtlety of awareness as you show up, as you do what you do, and see where that leads. And that means not pasting over any fixed view about it is okay or it isn't okay. Now, the second purification really has to do with purifying the mind. And this is the section of the Eightfold Path of Samadhi. Wise effort, wise mindfulness, wise concentration. And here it's just like instead of bringing wisdom and awareness to this external part of our lives, we're bringing the wisdom and awareness to the activity of our mind. And we're like taking responsibility, like, honey, I care about what's going on in this mind. And again, we can't just get in there and say, okay, I'm going to clean this mess up. Doesn't work. It just makes more mess. But what we can do is we can get interested, and we can stabilize present moment awareness, and we can observe what the mind is doing. And that is profoundly purifying. Just to observe the mind means we're not adding the 40 cartloads of fuel to any of the unwholesome patterns. And it means we're strengthening the wholesome patterns, because seeing the wholesome is what strengthens the wholesome. Seeing the unwholesome is what weakens the unwholesome. It's really that straightforward. It takes a lot of courage not to want to get in there and fix ourselves, or not to want to get in there and clean the mind out and make it just the way we think it should be. We have to trust this wisdom and awareness. Seeing things clearly is purifying. So that's 6. So we have right action, right wise speech, wise livelihood, make up that first purification, leading to the happiness of freedom from remorse or harmony. And then the second purification is wise effort, wise mindfulness, wise concentration. So here effort is like knowing how to sort of observe the unwholesome in ways that leads to the abandoning of them, to observe the wholesome in ways that strengthen them. Wise mindfulness just means being aware of the activity of the mind and body. And concentration is really that non-distractedness. It's that unification and the stabilizing of these other two, energy and effort and mindfulness, so that the mind really becomes pure. We have moments of that in meditation and sometimes in daily life where the mind is just really present, but not you doing it. It's just like it's come together, gathered, stable, and it's really, without any pride, it's a thing of beauty. A stable, clear, kind, unflappable mind is a thing of beauty. And that's samadhi. And that's we go from the mind being tormented by its habit energies to the mind experiencing calm and tranquility, that inner ease of the mind, free of hindrances, free of mental torments, because they've been quieted. The mental torments have been quieted, but not uprooted, which brings us to the third and last of the Eightfold Path. So the 2 more, right? Because we got 3 for sila, the relational part of our world, our lives, and 3 for purifying the mind, the samadhi part, and then 2 for the wisdom part. This is the most subtle part of the purification process. But we're still doing the same thing. We're bringing wisdom and awareness, but to the most subtle part of what's here and now, which is what in Buddhism we call the view, how the mind understands. And what the Buddha considers wise view is understanding the lawfulness. Like my states of misery, it's not accidental. They arise lawfully, conditionally, when those supporting conditions are there. And moments of freedom, that also arises lawfully when the supports are there. Because that makes us feel responsible. Well, let me see what I can do to stop feeding what is leading to contracted states and to support what ends up leading to released states, right? We start taking responsibility, even on this most subtle level, not to be feeding self-centered view. Because as we notice view, and again, it's subtle, but we can see the self-centeredness, like June in her report to us might have recognized in that moment that like part of the juiciness of the mind going back to the drama was there was a more solid sense of self, right? That sort of magnetic attraction to self-view, to taking things personally. And like on a deep level, like, oh, that's interesting. When there's that addiction or that dependence on self-view, there's always trouble. There's no way to have self-view without trouble, without anxiety, existential anxiety, or more obvious anxiety. And with the releasing of self-view comes the releasing of problems. and this is to be experienced. And so the purification of view leads to the peace of non-ignorance, non-delusion, right? Because one's view is in alignment with reality, which is its nature, not self. All of this that can be conceived of, all of this that can be experienced, is just nature. This sort of interaction of causes and conditions. There's nothing fixed in that. There's no fixed self in that. There's me in this sort of dynamic, changing process, but there's no me behind me that's really me, that's always me. That's just something that the mind is confused about and keeps constructing because it's its habit. And that self-view always contributes to the feeling of anxiety and uneasiness. Because the self doesn't make sense in reality. So there's always going to be dissonance. As long as there's a clear sense of a me in a fixed sense, there's always going to be anxiety. So we don't have to believe that, but we need to get interested in self-centered view when it's clear, when it's present, to see its unnecessariness, to see that correlation. When there's self-centeredness, there's anxiety. With the ceasing of self-centeredness, there's the releasing of anxiety. It's lawful, it's natural, there's nothing personal about it. There's nothing personal about the awakening process, actually. All this thing we call me, this life needs, is wisdom and awareness and the stabilizing of wisdom and awareness. Because it's the purifying force in our relational lives, in terms of the mind, the activity of our mind, and in terms of the most subtle aspect of our mind, the view or the underlying view or underlying beliefs or underlying ways that our mind frames experience. So the most subtle part of the activity of the mind, these deep habits of taking things personally or framing things in terms of this is being known by me, right? It's being known, but that last piece is totally extra and doesn't really align with our experience. All we know is this is being felt. By me, it's just a habit. So I'll leave it there so we have a little time for discussion, reflections on what I've said tonight about the Eightfold Path, questions that might come up. Obviously, it's maybe a many lifetime study, but just think about how wisdom and awareness allows us to purify all aspects of our experience of our lives. And that's what's liberating. Yeah, what comes to mind? Go ahead and unmute yourself if you want. The real clarity of the path, really arises when we start having just sort of almost accidentally, not that it isn't lawful, but accidentally experiencing a little freedom, like a couple of you described in your sharings at the beginning of the program tonight. And those moments of awakening, those moments of release of greed, hatred, and delusion, or moments of the mind relatively free of clinging or grasping, attachment, then it's those moments where the mind begins to intuit what we call the Eightfold Path. It's not going to intuit the Buddha's articulation of the Eightfold Path. It's going to actually intuit the way, the path. And the articulation is just a way to remember it, right? And that's that point I made earlier in the evening, that you have to make it real. So the map that you've learned lines up with your experience, your intuition that's coming out of your experience, your actual experience. Oh, I see how being present in this relational part of my life can be liberating. And I can see how not being present is actually dangerous because I'm subject to act out established habit energies that aren't good for my well-being or anybody's well-being if I'm not aware. But if I am aware, that awareness is not only protecting, but it opens up possibilities of things that might otherwise be the cause for suffering, the release of that, the healing of that, and the preventing of that. And same with working with our mind and working with one's view. Any reflections about your own changing understanding of the path over the years or months of your practice that feel like you'd be willing to share with the group?
I can share. My name is Cam. I use he, him. Um, Thank you. It's been great being here with all of you tonight. And yeah, over the years, I've just felt this carrying capacity that allows more mental states and identities kind of come, and it can feel very humbling when the truth kind of, awareness can get really sensitive, and it's like an identity comes down and lands on the shoulder, and truth comes and just kind of flicks it off. It's like, oh wait, I kind of like that spiritual identity. I was kind of grooving on that, and then truth just says, well, you can be with it all. And I get real interested when I hear about the teaching of, being so immersed with life that you get to start to enjoy the play of it. And I'm not there yet, but I definitely notice when I am identified, and well, the physical suffering is here. It's here and now. And future, what is that? All I know about is physical suffering here and now. And so, yeah, thank you all for listening.
Yeah, that is such a trustworthy, Cam was just sort of that last piece especially, is just that very earthy wisdom, like I may not know much in some moments of my life, but I know enough not to keep throwing fuel on the fire. That I know. And that itself is a powerful, powerful refuge. Like, I'm going to go forward with my life. I'm going to keep living, doing what I can do. But I have to say, I know a thing or two about not throwing fuel on the fire, not feeding. And that really sets up the whole path. That's not, it feels earthy, but it goes all the way to the depth of of liberation if we just keep following that. Just like Camp said, like even things relatively subtle, like having a spiritual identity, like, oh yeah, I'm getting somewhere in my practice. All of a sudden we see, oh, that's just a little bonfire. And I don't need to add fuel to that either. I don't need to grab a hold of that identity. Yeah, it's okay that that identity arose, but I don't have to do anything with it. It's just, yeah, of course that identity arises and it will cease. And then they'll have another thought, you know, the sky's blue, or is that a friendly dog or an unfriendly dog? But otherwise we could say, oh no, I'm a spiritual person. I should love that dog to death. And then it won't attack me or something. I was charged by a dog yesterday, so it's still on my mind. Any last thoughts before we say goodnight to each other? Thank you, Cam.
Thank you.
Well, really nice to be with everybody. Appreciate everyone's comments and willingness to share. And yes, just so you know, your audio is recorded, but the reason I spotlight myself is then your video is never part of what's on the YouTube channel, just audio. And lots coming up, of course, at the center. Let's see, Shelley is doing a half-day retreat on the 5th. I guess that's this Saturday, and I'll do a day-long retreat on the 26th of October. There's still space if you want to get out to Common Grounds Retreat Center on Saturday, the 12th. I'm leading a day-long retreat and assisted by Matthew King, a longtime leader in the center. And we'll have some social time after that. Gives people a chance to get out to the retreat center. So you can register for that on the calendar. Yeah, and lots of other things going on out at the retreat center this fall. We'll have the registration for the year-end retreat coming soon. That's December 26th through December 31st. I'll do a little bit, but it'll be mostly taught by Wynn Fricke and Shelley Graff. Our annual, I think we've been doing that now for 32 years, that year-end retreat. It's really an institution. We'll do it at the city center, at the retreat center, and also online for people on Zoom. So you have 3 options for that retreat. Thanks, everyone. Nice to be together. And I put in the chat some resources for this topic in case you might be interested. Feel free to say good night to everyone if you want.
Thanks,